Picture the airspace over the Zagros Mountains right now in the spring of 2026.
Right.
If you look at the telemetry data, you might see a patrol flight of F-14 Tomcats. And, I mean, these are aircraft that literally rolled off an American assembly line while Richard Nixon was president.
Yeah, it's wild to think about.
It is. And they are patrolling the skies directly above deeply buried, reinforced subterranean silos. Silos housing hypersonic, maneuverable re-entry vehicles that can traverse the Middle East in minutes.
Exactly.
So we are looking at a military apparatus that operates simultaneously as like a flying museum and a cutting-edge aerospace threat. It's just an absolute structural paradox.
It really is. I mean, it totally defies traditional military organizational theory. You know, most nation-states build their armed forces around interoperability and generational consistency.
Right. You upgrade the shield when you upgrade the sword.
Exactly. But Iran's aerospace and defense architecture operates on two completely different timelines. It's split across two entirely different chains of command, and they're attempting to counter a fifth-generation adversary with this heavily sanctioned hybrid inventory.
Which is exactly what we are tearing into for this deep dive. Today's mission is to unpack the reality of Iran's military power, specifically the Air Force and the integrated air defense network.
Yeah, mapping how it functioned, how it fundamentally collapsed.
Right, the total collapse during the June 2025 war.
And the radical reconstitution happening right now.
Exactly. And for you listening, we are pulling this from a massive stack of recent intelligence. We've got the Al-Habtoor Research Center's exhaustive post-mortem on the 2025 Israel-Iran war.
Which is a fantastic document, by the way.
Oh, it's incredible. We also have the Middle East Feed's 2026 Force Structure Analysis, tactical situation reports from the Institute for the Study of War, and specialized assessments on proxy networks from the IREM Center and Gray Dynamics.
And, you know, those sources are critical because the public perception of Iranian military capability is often really distorted.
Either by state propaganda or, like, external underestimation.
Right. And the Al-Habtoor and MEF documents, they strip away the rhetoric. They look purely at radar telemetry, supply chain forensics, and confirmed kinetic impacts over the last 24 months.
Yeah.
And of course, we're just laying out what these sources say, not taking any political sides here.
Always. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we analyze the electronic warfare and the drone swarms of 2026, we have to establish the baseline of this bizarre dual-structure military.
We do.
Because on paper, the numbers look formidable. You have a combined active personnel count of roughly 610,000.
Yeah, which sounds huge.
It does. But reading the Middle East Feed analysis, that number is highly deceptive because it's split. You've got the regular military, the Artesh, with about 420,000 personnel, and then the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, with 190,000.
And I think it's really important to emphasize they aren't just different branches like the Army and the Navy in the U.S.
Right. They are two separate militaries operating within the same borders.
Which is crazy. Why build it like that?
It's driven entirely by regime survival and, well, institutional paranoia.
Paranoia about their own people.
Exactly. The foundational trauma of the Islamic Republic was the 1979 revolution. When the current regime took power, they inherited Shah's military, which was the Artesh. But they fundamentally distrusted it.
Because the Artesh had been trained by the Americans.
Right, armed by the Americans, trained by the Americans, and it possessed an officer corps that the new clerics feared might launch a counter-coup. So they established the IRGC as this ideologically pure counterweight.
Which creates an immediate operational friction.
Oh, massive friction.
Because the Artesh is tasked with defending the geographical borders of the state. But the IRGC is tasked with defending the political revolution itself.
Yeah, and because the regime trusts the IRGC, they give them all the premier strategic portfolios.
The shiny new toys. Exactly. The IRGC controls the ballistic missiles, the asymmetric naval warfare in the Gulf, the Quads Force, the offensive drone programs, all of it.
Meanwhile, the Artesh Air Force is left holding the bag with the legacy aviation equipment.
Yeah.
And that equipment history is fascinating to me because pre-1979, the Shah had basically been given a blank check by the U.S. Department of Defense.
Oh, absolutely. The Imperial Iranian Air Force was arguably the most technologically dominant aviation branch in the Middle East at the time. The centerpiece, of course, was the Grumman F-14 Tomcat.
Right.
The Shah purchased 80 of them. And that was primarily to intercept high-altitude Soviet MiG-25 reconnaissance flights.
And the U.S. allowed Iran, and literally only Iran, to acquire the F-14, right?
Yes. complete with the AWG-9 radar system and the AM-54 Phoenix long-range air-to-air missiles. It was an unprecedented export of advanced U.S. capability. Nobody else got that tech.
But then the 1979 hostage crisis happens.
Yeah.
Diplomatic ties are severed, and the subsequent U.S. embargo drops like a guillotine.
Yeah, overnight.
So the supply chain for those F-14s, along with their F-4 Phantoms and F-5s, just drops to zero.
Completely to zero.
Now, people throw around the term cannibalization really casually when talking about how Iran kept these planes flying for 40 years. But running this Air Force is like, well, imagine maintaining a collection of vintage Ferraris, but you were legally banned from ever buying spare parts.
That's a great way to put it.
How do they even keep them in the air? If you look at the engineering realities, cannibalization isn't just swapping out a spark plug.
No, not at all.
If you pull a stressed titanium wing spar or like a complex hydraulic actuator off an F-14A that has 4,000 flight hours and try to bolt it onto another airframe with completely different structural fatigue, I mean, you were begging for a catastrophic mid-air failure. It's an engineering nightmare.
It really is. And it requires a massive, unheralded level of reverse engineering. The Iranian technicians had to learn how to machine highly complex aerospace alloys without original schematics or any OEM support.
They just had to figure it out in the dark.
Basically, they had to bypass proprietary American avionics software to integrate indigenous weapon systems. And remember, they're doing this on an airframe designed to talk exclusively to NATO standard hardware. The fact that any F-14s are still flying is a testament to the sheer desperation, really, and mechanical ingenuity of the Artesh ground crews.
And that desperation led to some incredibly strange fleet acquisitions over the years. Like you read the fleet manifest today, and you've got these American Tomcats parked next to Chinese F-7s.
Which are essentially reverse-engineered Soviet MiG-21s.
Right, and Russian Su-24s. And many of those Soviet aircraft weren't even purchased. They literally fell out of the sky during the 1991 Gulf War.
Yeah, when Iraqi pilots defected to Iran to escape the U.S.-led coalition.
Dozens of Iraqi Su-22s, MiG-29s, and Mirage F-1s just fled across the border.
And the Iranian government simply impounded them, absorbed them into the Artesh inventory, and never gave them back.
Finders keepers.
Literally.
Yeah.
But think about the logistics. Integrating a French-built Mirage F-1 alongside a Soviet MiG-29 and an American F-14, they all utilize completely disparate data links, totally different maintenance protocols, and weapon interfaces.
So you don't really have an integrated Air Force.
No, you have a collection of localized, disconnected squadrons that can't talk to each other in the air.
And that disjointed reality was forged in blood during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. That 8-year conflict is like the defining crucible for modern Iranian military doctrine.
Absolutely.
Because early in that war, the Iranian F-14s dominated. But as the attrition set in and the parts ran out, Saddam Hussein's Air Force, which was fueled by constant resupply from both the Soviets and the West, began to gain air superiority.
Yeah, they launched the War of the Cities, bombing Tehran and major population centers with impunity.
And that has to be a traumatizing turning point.
It was. That is the exact moment the Iranian strategic calculus shifted permanently. The Artesh Air Force realized they could not sustain a symmetric war of attrition in the skies.
They just didn't have the planes or the parts.
Right. The Iranian leadership realized that attempting to achieve conventional air superiority against heavily backed adversaries was functionally impossible, so they bypassed the sky.
If you cannot field interceptors to shoot down incoming bombers,
you build ballistic missiles to destroy the bombers on their runways, or to strike the adversary's cities in retaliation.
Right. It forces a deterrent balance without needing a fifth-generation fighter. A ballistic missile doesn't require a human pilot during high-G maneuvers. You know? It just requires coordinates and solid fuel propellant.
Yeah, exactly. So they spent decades pouring their GDP into the IRGC Aerospace Force, building this immense decentralized arsenal of short and medium-range ballistic missiles, and later loitering munitions.
They essentially accepted that their airspace would be porous, relying instead on a constant position model, make it too painful for anyone to attack.
And that doctrine worked theoretically for decades. It kept regional adversaries cautious. But, a doctrine of cost imposition requires that your ground-based air defenses can at least protect your command nodes and your mobile missile launchers.
Long enough to actually execute the retaliation.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the ultimate stress test. We transition from theory to the kinetic reality of June 2025. And here's what gets really interesting, because the Al-Habtoor Research Center's assessment of Operations Epic Fury and Rising Lion completely shatters the Hollywood perception of modern warfare.
It really does.
I mean, we always picture Wars as dogfights and explosions, right?
Yeah.
Missiles streaking across the sky, anti-aircraft artillery firing blindly into the night. But reading the after-action reports, are you saying this war was basically won on a computer screen before the shooting even started?
What's fascinating here is how the electromagnetic spectrum is now the primary domain of modern combat. If you can't control the spectrum, your planes and missiles are just expensive paperweights. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the coalition, primarily the U.S. and Israel, understood that striking deeply buried nuclear facilities, like Fordo or Natanz, required sustained loiter time over the target.
Right, because you can't just fly in, drop a single bomb, and leave.
Exactly. You need bunker-busting munitions deployed in precise sequence to dig through the rock. And to achieve that loiter time, you must systematically blind the integrated air defense system beforehand.
And they achieved that blindness not with stealth bombers initially, but with specialized electronic warfare platforms. The reports detail the use of U.S. Navy EA-18G Growlers operating far outside the kinetic threat rings.
Yeah, utilizing cognitive EW systems like the ALQ-249 next-generation jammer. And alongside them, the IDF deployed their 514th Spectrum Warfare Battalion.
And the tactics went way beyond traditional noise jamming, right? Where you just blast radio frequency energy to drown out the enemy's radar.
Oh, right. Noise jamming is effectively like shouting loudly in a dark room. Anyone can tell you're shouting. Instead, the coalition utilized localized spoofing and network intrusion. They manipulated the data packets within the Iranian command and control data links themselves.
So wait. An Iranian radar operator sitting in a bunker defending an S-400 battery. They aren't just seeing a blank screen.
No, not necessarily. They might be seeing a screen flooded with hundreds of false kinematic tracks. Ghost planes. Or even worse, the system might show zero anomalies at all, while a squadron of F-35s is operating directly overhead.
That is terrifying.
They completely severed the nervous system between the early warning radars and the fire control radars.
And once that spectrum dominance was achieved, then the physical destruction of the hardware began.
Yeah, it was systematic. Over 80 surface-to-air missile batteries and 120 mobile launch platforms were dismantled in the opening phase.
And we have to look closely at what failed here, because the pre-war rhetoric out of Tehran promised this impenetrable shield. Their highest-end system was the Russian-supplied S-300 PMU-2. It was supposed to be the crown jewel of their point defense.
And it failed completely. The IDF utilized a combination of stand-in jamming and long-range anti-radiation missiles to target the 30 N6E2 Tombstone engagement radars.
So the S-300s were blinded and then physically destroyed before they could process a firing solution.
Exactly. Some were even hit while operating under strict emission silence protocols, meaning they had their radars turned off to hide.
But the coalition still found them.
Yeah, using passive or synthetic aperture radar mapping. They mapped the ground and found the launchers anyway.
The Russian hardware failure was a severe blow, but the failure of Iran's indigenous systems was arguably more devastating to their operational confidence. For years, Iran had touted the Bavar 373 as their domestic equivalent to the Russian S-400.
Right. They claimed it could engage stealth targets.
And I want to push back on the popular explanations of why the Bavar 373 failed. Because you often hear mainstream analysts use analogies like, stealth is like shining a flashlight on a bird instead of a commercial airliner. But our listeners know about radar cross-sections and X-band frequencies. The issue with the Bavar 373's Mirage 4 phased array radar wasn't merely a detection problem, right? It was a failure of track file generation against a very low observable, or VLO, airframe.
That is precisely the distinction. Detecting an anomaly in the airspace is one thing. You might get intermittent spikes of radar return from an F-35 when it opens a weapons bay, or banks at a specific angle.
To flash on the screen.
Exactly. But the Mirage 4's processing architecture couldn't establish a persistent track while scan. The signal-to-noise ratio drops so precipitously against a VLO geometry that the radar cannot achieve the coherent integration time required to formulate a weapons-grade lock.
So the radar knows something is there, but it cannot feed a continuous stream of spatial coordinates to an interceptor missile.
It's just guessing at shadows. And the proof is in the data. The Al-Habtoor report cites a staggering statistic. During the entire initial collapse in June 2025, the Iranian Integrated Air Defense Network failed to record the downing of a single manned Israeli fighter jet.
Not a single one.
Not one. It was a total, undisputed establishment of localized air supremacy by the coalition.
It reinforced the brutal reality that if you cannot process radar returns at the speed of modern fifth-generation warfare, your heavy surface-to-air missiles are completely useless.
Yeah, you are simply providing targets for the adversary suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD campaigns.
And losing the hardware was only the first phase of the disaster for Tehran, because the military network is only as robust as the command architecture directing it. The other half was a complete decapitation of their command structure.
It was incredibly fast. The June strikes didn't just target phased arrays. They aggressively targeted the human capital of the IRGC.
Within the first hours of the assault, the top leadership was wiped out. Hossein Salami, the commander-in-chief of the IRGC, and Mohammad Bagheri, the chief of staff of the armed forces, gone.
The operational shock of losing the top echelon of the military hierarchy in the midst of a massive multi-axis aerospace assault, I mean, it cannot be overstated.
It plunges everything into chaos.
But tactically, the most significant loss was Amir Ali Hajizadeh. He was the long-standing commander of the IRGC Aerospace Force.
Right. And Hajizadeh wasn't just a general. He was the doctrinal architect of the entire asymmetric missile strategy we talked about earlier. Losing him is like the U.S. Navy losing Hyman Rickover at the dawn of the nuclear sub-era.
That's a really good comparison. He understood the intricate web of mobile launch deployments and proxy integration better than anyone.
So when he was killed, his deputy, Majid Musavi, assumed command on June 13th.
And Musavi inherited a completely blind, burning air defense network and a command structure rapidly devolving into factional infighting.
There was intel intercepted and analyzed by Iran International, detailing massive internal recriminations aimed at Musavi.
Oh, yeah. Heavy criticism for his supposed absence during the crisis, and for allegedly providing inaccurate data regarding Iran's retaliatory missile launches, essentially to cover up the scope of the failure.
Which really exposes the fatal flaw of that dual Artesh-IRGC structure we outlined at the beginning. On paper, it looks huge, but having overlapping command structures might prevent a coup in peacetime, but during an active electronic blinding event, it creates a lethal coordination gap.
Exactly. The ISW situation reports highlighted literal communication breakdowns between the Artesh air defense sectors, who were supposed to manage the airspace, and the IRGC command nodes, who actually controlled the high-end interceptors.
So they didn't even know who was in charge.
They couldn't verify who was authorizing launch commands. It was widespread chaos.
And the coalition capitalized on that chaos to strike at the regime's center of gravity. They didn't limit their target deck to military bases on the periphery. They pushed deep into Tehran itself.
Yeah, they targeted strategic security nodes, like the Mohammad Rasulullah Corps.
Which is the specific IRGC unit responsible for security in the greater Tehran area.
Right. They hit the Imam Hadi Command Center and the Imam Ali security battalions. And it's crucial to understand these aren't just military units defending against jets. These are the internal security apparatuses historically deployed to crack down on domestic protests.
So striking them serves a dual purpose. You are degrading the IRGC's ability to coordinate a military defense against the planes while simultaneously destroying the motor pools and communication nodes they use to police their own streets.
Exactly. The regime is suddenly faced with an external existential threat and a compromised ability to maintain domestic order.
It was a strategic masterclass in inducing systemic paralysis.
It really was. And the ceasefire in late June 2025 left the Iranian leadership acutely aware that their foundational defense doctrine had failed. They knew they could not survive a second iteration of that campaign.
So with their defensive shield shattered, their leaders gone, and their airspace violated, Iran was forced into a desperate post-war reset.
Yes, leading to the massive geopolitical pivot that defines their posture today in 2026.
Right. If the West won't sell to them, they must turn east. But let's look at the mechanics of this reset, because their domestic air defense industry essentially failed the ultimate field test, and the Russian S-300 proved highly vulnerable.
Very vulnerable.
And structurally, they are heavily sanctioned and locked out of the SWIFT financial system. So how exactly is a financially crippled nation embarking on a multi-billion-dollar Eastern shopping spree to rebuild a national defense grid?
It's all about barter. They execute it through state-level barter mechanics, entirely bypassing the U.S. dollar. They formalized an immense oil-for-weapons dark fleet mechanism.
Wow.
The data indicates this is anchored in annual oil trade volumes exceeding $50 billion, heavily facilitated by China, who absorbs the vast majority of Iran's crude output.
So how does the money move?
Well, Chinese state-linked financial entities essentially hold the oil revenue in localized accounts, which Iran then draws down to settle defense procurement debts with both Beijing and Moscow.
So it's this macroscopic shadow economy.
Precisely.
And the intelligence leaks from the Russian defense conglomerate Rostec reveal exactly what Iran is buying with that oil. Let's look at the Russian track first, which is heavily focused on the kinetic hardware. Contract 364 outlines a $6.5 billion acquisition centered on 48 Su-35 fighters.
Right.
Now, I have to ask, from a purely tactical standpoint, the Su-35 is a highly maneuverable 4++ generation fighter, but it has a massive radar cross-section. Against an F-35 or an F-22, it's basically a glowing target on the radar.
Yeah, it is.
So why spend billions on an airframe that structurally belongs to the late 1990s?
Because the Su-35 isn't being procured to engage in close-in dogfights with F-25s. Iran understands the kinematic reality. They know they'd lose that fight.
So what's the play?
The Su-35 is equipped with the Urbasi passive electronically scanned array radar. It has immense power output, and the aircraft can carry a heavy payload of very long-range air-to-air missiles like the R-37F.
Okay.
The tactical goal is to push the coalition's support assets like the AWACS early warning planes and the aerial refueling tankers further back from Iranian airspace.
If you force the tankers to operate 500 miles away, you severely limit the loiter time of the F-35s over your targets.
Exactly. It's an anti-accessoria denial capability projected into the air.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
And crucially, the leaked contract includes clauses for local assembly and technology transfer. Iran is trying to relearn aerospace manufacturing, attempting to bridge that generational gap they've suffered since the F-14 embargo.
Yeah, but setting up a production line takes years. In the interim, Russia established an air bridge in late 2025 to deliver S-400 Triumf batteries, replacing the destroyed S-300s.
And the deployment of the S-400 is significant because it extends the engagement envelope up to 400 kilometers. Plus, it features vastly improved electronic countermeasures compared to the legacy systems they lost.
Right, but like you said earlier, buying heavy Russian hardware solves only half the problem.
Exactly. If Epic Fury proved that interceptors and missiles are completely useless without spectrum dominance, who is stepping in to rebuild their digital architecture?
This is where the Chinese track becomes the most critical element of the reset.
Beijing is effectively becoming the systems integrator, the brain of the new defense grid.
Yeah. While Russia provides the heavy metal, the interceptors, China is supplying the advanced sensor fusion required to actually survive in a contested electromagnetic environment.
So we see the delivery of the HQ-9B strategic surface-to-air missile systems from China to replace the S-300s, alongside highly mobile, short-range systems like the HQ-17AE.
And that HQ-17AE is specifically designed to act as a point defense bodyguard against the loitering munitions that devastated Iranian radars in 2025.
But the piece of hardware that truly alters the tactical landscape is the Chinese JY-26 radar.
Yes. The JY-26 is a 3D long-range early warning radar operating in the ultra-high frequency, or UHF, and very high frequency, VHF, bands.
No, wait. UHF and VHF wavelengths are physically massive. They're measured in meters. When a radar operates in those bands, you might be able to detect the turbulence or the physical anomaly of a stealth fighter, but you get a search box the size of a county.
That's true.
You get azimuth and range, but you lack the precise elevation and continuous track required to guide a missile. You can't just shoot an F-35 down using a JY-26.
You're entirely correct. A UHF radar provides a relatively low-fidelity track. It cannot formulate a firing solution. But this raises the important question regarding sensor fusion.
Okay, how does that work here?
What the JY-26 does is provide cueing data. It detects the VLO anomaly at a range of, say, 400 to 500 kilometers. It then transmits that rough spatial coordinate via secure data link to the X-band fire control radar of an S-400 or HQ-9B battery.
Ah. So instead of the X-band radar scanning a massive volume of sky, diluting its energy, it stares at a highly specific, concentrated azimuth.
Exactly. You concentrate the high-frequency radar energy precisely where the UHF radar tells you the target is. And that dramatically increases the probability of overcoming the stealth airframe's radar-absorbent materials and achieving a weapons lock.
Okay, conceptually that's brilliant. But let's look at the logistical nightmare of this approach. You've got 1970s American jets, domestic Iranian prototypes, Russian missiles, and Chinese radars. How do you plug an S-400 into a Chinese radar in an old American base?
With great difficulty.
Isn't this just a Frankenstein's monster of military? I mean, the protocols, the waveforms, the encryption standards, They're all completely different.
It is an integration nightmare. The structural constraint highlighted by the IRIM Center and Al-Hub Tour isn't the hardware, it's the network architecture.
Can they even write the software patches? Or establish the gateway nodes required to allow a Chinese radar to talk to a Russian missile battery?
And do all that while under active cyber and electronic attack by the IDF and U.S. Cyber Command. Historical precedent suggests this will take years to optimize. It is a massive vulnerability.
So if this unified digital defense network is still years away from full operational capability, and their airspace is still highly vulnerable right now in 2026, how are they projecting power today?
Because they haven't capitulated.
Right. They are doubling down on what they know best, asymmetric warfare.
Yes. The regime is actively pursuing what they call the long arm strategy, or Dasti Bolin.
Dasti Bolin.
Yeah. And this doctrine is a tacit acknowledgement of their current aerospace vulnerability. If you cannot contest the sky over Tehran, you project power asymmetrically into the maritime domain.
So we see the IRGC Navy, under commanders like Tangsiri and Fadavi, aggressively expanding operations out of the constrained waters of the Persian Gulf, pushing into the Sea of Oman, the Red Sea, and the broader Indian Ocean.
The objective isn't to win a naval battle against an American carrier strike group. They know they'd lose. It's pure cost imposition.
They utilize fast attack craft, anti-ship cruise missiles, and sea-denial naval mines to threaten commercial shipping choke points.
Right. If you threaten the Strait of Hormuz or the Bab el-Mandeb, you don't need to sink an American destroyer to win. You just need to drive up the global maritime insurance premiums to a level that causes severe economic distress in Western capitals.
Disrupt the supply chain.
Exactly. And this maritime pivot is driving one of the most fascinating aerospace developments in their inventory, the evolution of the Covert 313.
This is a perfect example of Iranian asymmetric adaptation, because years ago, the regime unveiled the Covert 313 as a domestic, manned, fifth-generation stealth fighter.
And the global defense community openly mocked it.
Oh, mercilessly. The cockpit avionics looked like commercial off-the-shelf components. The engine intakes were aerodynamically unviable. The airframe appeared to be a fiberglass mock-up. People just dismissed it as state propaganda.
Which, at the time, it almost certainly was. But the Gray Dynamics analysis from 2026 confirms a massive pivot.
They didn't just throw it away.
No, they stripped out the cockpit, they re-engineered the internal payload bays, and repurposed the aerodynamic design. The Covert 313 has been reborn as the Jazz 313.
A heavy, low-observable, unmanned combat aerial vehicle, specifically designed for carrier-based or maritime strike operations.
Yeah, they took a failed propaganda project and turned it into a stealth drone designed to swarm naval assets.
But the coalition is acutely aware of this shift, and the psychological warfare between the two sides is escalating. The ISW situation reports highlighted a deeply strange event recently, an Israeli kinetic strike on an Iranian refueling tanker.
Specifically, a Boeing 707 or KC-747, yeah.
Well, it was parked on the tarmac in Mashhad. Now, Mashhad is in the extreme northeast of Iran, right near the border with Turkmenistan. It's over 1,000 miles from Israeli airspace.
It's incredibly deep inside the country. Striking a logistical asset that deep inside sovereign territory isn't about degrading an immediate tactical capability.
It is pure strategic signaling.
Exactly. The coalition is demonstrating to the IRGC leadership that despite the acquisition of S-400s and Chinese early warning radars, they retain the capability to penetrate the most remote corners of Iranian airspace at will, without suffering attrition.
Basically saying, we can touch you anywhere.
Right.
But the Iranians are signaling right back, and the kinetic reality is shifting, because the most jarring data point in the 2026 assessments is from April 3rd. When Iran successfully shot down a U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle over Iranian territory.
That was a huge moment.
It is the first confirmed U.S. combat aircraft lost in theater since the 2025 war began. How does a disjointed, heavily attrited defense network manage to down a modern American fighter in an environment where the U.S. supposedly maintains spectrum dominance?
It indicates that Iranian air defense operators are adapting their tactics. They're learning how to survive the electronic warfare environment. Well, if active radar emission invites an anti-radiation missile, operators shift to passive detection. They utilize infrared search and track systems, acoustic sensors, and optical tracking to establish an ambush.
So they wait for the strike package to commit to a specific ingress route.
Right. They leave their radars completely silent and fire using optical guidance.
And it is incredibly difficult to jam a sensor that isn't emitting a frequency.
Exactly. You can't spoof a camera lens in the same way you spoof a radar wave.
So what does this all mean? We have spent the last hour dissecting a military architecture that is simultaneously broken and lethal. They suffered a catastrophic electronic and kinetic defeat in 2025. They are spending billions on Eastern hardware but struggling with the basic digital integration of those systems, and they are relying on asymmetric maritime drones and proxy networks. If we look at the 2026 force structure analysis, how exactly does Iran plan to survive a sustained conflict tomorrow? Are they actually stronger now?
I'd say they operate on a hybrid deterrence model. They plan to survive through a highly calibrated 72-hour matrix.
Walk me through that.
If you wargame a preemptive strike against Iran today, their operational doctrine does not attempt to contest air superiority in the first 12 hours. They just don't even try.
Because they know they can't.
Right. Their entire focus is on asset preservation and dispersal. They move mobile ballistic missile launchers into deep subterranean tunnel networks. They disperse drone swarms from centralized bases to austere distributed launch sites.
So they accept that the initial wave of coalition strikes will destroy the static radar sites and runway infrastructure.
Precisely. They let the first wave crash over them. But moving into hours 12 to 36, the doctrine shifts to aggressive cost imposition.
That's when they strike back.
Yeah. They utilize the assets that survived the initial blow to launch synchronized, saturated salvos of medium-range ballistic missiles. They attempt to overwhelm the intercept capacity of systems like David's Sling and the Arrow 3.
Just sheer volume.
And simultaneously, they activate the long arm. They deploy the JAS 313 drones against maritime shipping and utilize their proxy networks in Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon to strike at coalition logistics hubs and regional U.S. bases across the Middle East.
They intentionally widen the theater. The logic being, if you violate our airspace and degrade our infrastructure, we will ensure that global oil markets panic and regional stability collapses.
Exactly. And by hours 36 to 72, the objective is to leverage that widespread regional chaos to force international diplomatic intervention and establish a ceasefire on favorable terms.
So the goal of the Iranian military in 2026 is not to win a high-tech maneuver campaign against a peer adversary.
No, the goal is pure attrition. They maintain a sprawling, distributed retaliatory capacity designed to make the political, economic, and human cost of sustaining an air campaign simply too high for the adversary to bear.
It's the ultimate manifestation of a hedgehog strategy, just be too spiky to eat. Which brings us to the end of this deep dive. We've mapped the incredible, contradictory evolution of this military entity. From the pristine, elite F-14 Tomcat squadrons of the 1970s, slowly degrading into a mechanically cannibalized ghost fleet due to decades of isolation.
It's a crazy trajectory.
We walk through the brutal reality check of June 2025, where a multi-billion-dollar integrated air defense network was completely dismantled. Not by a massive wave of bombers, but by invisible algorithms, spoofed data links, and electronic dominance.
And we examined the resultant leadership vacuum, the internal friction between the Artesh and the IRGC, and the massive geopolitical realignment driving their current acquisition of Russian Su-35s and Chinese digital infrastructure.
But the core takeaway from the 2026 assessments is that despite the influx of new fighter jets and advanced surface-to-air missiles, Iran's true strategic gravity remains grounded in asymmetric warfare. Their power lies in the dirt, deeply buried missile silos, dispersed drone launch rails, and the willingness to expand the theater of conflict.
It is an architecture fundamentally designed to absorb immense punishment, survive the initial strike, and ensure the subsequent retaliation forces the adversary to step back.
And exploring the mechanics of that 2025 collapse leaves me with a final lingering thought for you, the listener, to consider on your own. We saw a modern, heavily armed nation-state entirely paralyzed because they lost the battle for the electromagnetic spectrum. Their radars were blinded and their data links were severed before a single kinetic weapon was dropped. Given the rapid advancement of cognitive electronic warfare and AI-driven spectrum manipulation, our traditional manned combat aircraft becoming completely obsolete. If a future conflict can be decisively won by algorithms that fry enemy sensors in milliseconds, is global military supremacy still defined by who has the fastest jet or the stealthiest airframe? Or has the ultimate high ground shifted entirely to the control of the invisible waves transmitting through the sky? Think about how that alters the definition of deterrence for the next decade. Because if your adversary controls the spectrum, the pilot in the cockpit doesn't even know the war has started until it's already over.